Clara stood in the doorway of the attic, the soft creak of the floorboards beneath her feet echoing a silence she hadn't expected. Dust particles floated in the afternoon light, visible through the single small window that had always framed the sky like a painting. Everything looked the same, except for the one thing that mattered most. Her mother's trunk was gone. She blinked, as if her eyes were playing tricks on her. The old trunk had sat there for years, wedged between her father's childhood record player and an unused rocking chair. It had been there when Clara was a little girl, when she would sneak up to the attic just to run her fingers along its ornate brass latch. It had been there through birthdays, holidays, and even after her mother's funeral, when Clara had carefully repacked it with every item that reminded her of who she was before everything fell apart. Now it was just empty space, a void, as if her mother's presence had been physically erased from the house. Clara's fingers twitched, and her heart raced with a sickening churn of disbelief. She walked to the exact spot where the trunk had been and knelt, brushing her hand over the dusty floorboards. There were faint drag marks, evidence that it had been moved. But where? She descended the attic ladder quickly, 2 steps at a time, barely registering the sharp tug in her knee. Her breath was shallow by the time she reached the kitchen, where Valerie stood at the island, slicing pears with her usual precision. Her father wasn't home, likely still at work, and that suited Clara just fine. She didn't want his interference. Not now. "Where's the trunk?" Clara asked, barely able to contain the tremble in her voice. Valerie didn't look up. "What trunk?" "You know exactly what trunk. The old one in the attic. The one with my mother's things in it." There was a pause, just long enough for Clara to feel her stomach knot. "Oh," Valerie said casually, placing a pear slice into a glass bowl. "That old thing? I got rid of it." Clara stared at her. "You what?" Valerie finally looked up, her expression devoid of remorse. "It was just collecting dust. This house is cluttered enough as it is, and your father and I are trying to make space for the renovation. We need to move on, Clara. Your past is just getting in our way." For a few seconds, there was no sound in the kitchen except the hum of the refrigerator. Clara's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, she felt as though she might collapse. Her legs weakened, and she reached out to steady herself against the counter. "You threw out my mother's heirlooms?" she whispered. Valerie shrugged. There was nothing valuable in there. Just some old linens, costume jewelry, and dusty letters. No one needs to keep junk like that. It's not healthy. Clara didn't yell. She didn't cry. Instead, a numbness washed over her, cold, steady, and deep. She turned and walked out of the kitchen without another word, each step a quiet scream echoing inside her chest. Back in her apartment that night, Clara sat on the edge of her bed, the room dim except for the soft glow of her desk lamp. She held a photograph in her hands, one of the few she had kept in her own space rather than at her father's house. It was a picture of her mother, seated on a garden bench, her hair pinned back with a vintage comb that had once belonged to Clara's great-grandmother. That comb had been in the trunk, along with her grandmother's hand-stitched handkerchiefs, the embroidered table runner from her parents' wedding, and the necklace Clara's mother wore every birthday. They weren't just things. They were memory anchors, proof of a lineage, a story. She felt grief surge like a tide she couldn't push back, but underneath it, another feeling began to emerge. It was slow at first, like the faint glow of dawn on a cold winter morning. But it grew, quiet, focused, unrelenting. This wasn't just a careless mistake. It was intentional, deliberate. A woman had looked at another woman's life and deemed it irrelevant, disposable. Clara couldn't let that go. Not because she needed revenge in the way the movies portrayed it, dramatic, petty, and immediate, but because her mother deserved better. Her memory deserved better, and Clara wouldn't let it end in a landfill or the backroom of a pawn shop. The next morning, she took the day off work and drove to the local donation centers around town. She printed pictures of the heirlooms from an old photo album, using them like missing person posters. Most volunteers were sympathetic, but had seen nothing. Clara left her number anyway, along with a description of Valerie in case someone recalled a donation from a woman matching her stepmother's height, voice, or face. She repeated the process at antique stores, thrift shops, even the weekend flea market. She spoke to dealers, appraisers, and anyone willing to listen. The search became a quiet ritual, one rooted in sorrow but driven by love. Sometimes she went days without any leads, but she didn't stop. One afternoon, almost 2 weeks after the trunk's disappearance, Clara wandered into a vintage jewelry shop tucked between a bookstore and a dry cleaner in an older part of town. The air smelled of brass and lavender, and the store was cluttered in a cozy way, with glass display cases full of brooches, lockets, and pocket watches. She had barely spoken when her eyes landed on a necklace behind the counter. A teardrop-shaped emerald surrounded by tiny seed pearls, hanging from a thin gold chain. Her throat tightened. She knew that necklace like she knew her own reflection. Her mother had worn it in every formal family portrait. It had been her grandmother's before her, and her mother had once told her, in a soft, wistful tone, "This will be yours one day, Clara. Wear when you need to feel strong." She pointed to the glass. That necklace. Where did it come from? The shopkeeper, a kind-eyed woman in her 60s, looked up from polishing a silver bracelet. That one, beautiful piece, came in a few weeks ago. Let me check the log. She flipped through a binder and paused. Yes, sold by a woman named Valerie. That's what she wrote down. She frowned. Is there a problem? Clara took a slow breath. That necklace belonged to my mother. It was never hers to sell. The shopkeeper's expression softened. I see. Well, I can sell it back to you. I haven't cleaned or listed it yet. You'd be doing me a favor. Clara nodded and pulled out her wallet. As she paid, she asked for a copy of the seller's information. The shopkeeper provided a scanned receipt with Valerie's signature and the date of the transaction. When Clara stepped outside, the necklace in a soft velvet pouch clutched tightly in her hand, the sky above looked a little brighter. Not because she had everything back, she didn't, but because she now had something more important than grief. She had proof. Clara sat at her small kitchen table, the velvet pouch containing her mother's emerald necklace resting softly in the center like an artifact in a museum. The coffee beside her had gone cold hours ago, untouched. She had been staring at the receipt from the vintage jewelry store, turning it over and over in her hands, reading every word as if it might shift and tell her something new. Valerie's signature, though elegant and poised, now looked venomous in Clara's eyes. What had once been resentment was transforming into resolve. The necklace was just the beginning. If Valerie had sold one heirloom, how many more had she discarded, bartered away, or deemed clutter? Clara couldn't let this pass as a misunderstanding. It wasn't. This was theft. Not the kind that leaves a broken window or missing cash, but the quiet kind. The cruel kind that erases memory and legacy. That decides, with a smirk and a donation box, that the life before her doesn't matter anymore. She pulled out her laptop and opened a new folder titled Heirloom Recovery. She needed a plan. Over the next few days, Clara committed herself to piecing together what happened. She began by listing every item she remembered placing in the trunk. The emerald necklace, now recovered, her grandmother's embroidered tablecloth, a set of hand-stitched handkerchiefs, a silver brush and mirror set, 2 journals her mother kept between 1985 and 1997, a music box that still played Swan Lake, and a wooden rosary that had belonged to her great-grandfather. She remembered the placement of each piece, the way she'd folded and layered them with tissue paper. Her mother's handwriting in the journals was still so vivid in her mind that Clara could almost hear the pages turning when she closed her eyes. She called her father first. She didn't want to, but she needed to know if he had any idea what Valerie had done. "Dad, I need to ask you something important," she said as calmly as she could when he picked up. "Of course. Everything okay? Did you know that Valerie threw out the trunk in the attic? The one with Mom's heirlooms?" There was a long silence. "Then what trunk?" Clara gritted her teeth. "Dad, the big brown one with brass hinges. It was behind the rocking chair. I told you I was keeping Mom's things there before I moved out." He sounded uncertain. "Valerie did mention something about reorganizing the attic, but I didn't realize she meant that. I thought you took those things with you." "I didn't. I trusted they'd be safe." I am sorry, honey. I didn't know." Clara didn't push further. He sounded genuinely surprised, and perhaps quietly ashamed. But she wasn't ready to absolve him either. His ignorance had come at a cost. After the call, Clara returned to her mission. She created flyers and started circulating them among local antique dealers and thrift stores, complete with photos and item descriptions. Some shopkeepers were dismissive or simply shrugged, but a few took genuine interest. One woman at a consignment store in the neighboring town even remembered Valerie. Tall woman, brunette, sharp voice? She came in last month with a couple of boxes. There were linens and a few decorative items. I think we sold some of them already, but I can check. Clara left her name and number and received a call the next day. They had found a monogrammed handkerchief with the initials SW, matching her mother's name, Sarah Whitmore. Clara drove there immediately, heart pounding, and bought the item without hesitation. 2 weeks passed. Slowly, piece by piece, Clara recovered fragments of what had been lost. From a second-hand bookstore, she retrieved one of her mother's journals. It had been sold in a bundle of vintage notebooks. She recognized the soft blue leather cover and the indentation where her mother had once placed a pressed flower between the pages. She opened it and saw the looping cursive that had narrated Clara's childhood birthdays, sleepless nights, and Sunday mornings filled with pancakes and piano music. The ink was slightly faded, but the warmth it radiated was unchanged. Clara began documenting everything meticulously. For each recovered item, she noted where it was found, the date, the name of the shop or person, and the circumstances of the sale. She scanned receipts, photographed the objects, and stored them with care. She had already contacted a friend from law school, Emily, now working as a junior associate at a local firm, to discuss the possibility of legal action. Emily had listened quietly as Clara explained everything. At the end of the call, she said, "You might have a case. If the items were demonstrably yours or family heirlooms you had rights to, and she knowingly sold them without permission, that can be grounds for a civil claim, especially since you have evidence." Evidence. That word gave Clara strength. She began recording her conversations with Valerie. Nothing overt, just simple interactions when she visited her father's house. Valerie would often drop hints of her distaste for living in the past or make barbed comments about Clara being too sentimental. Clara stayed calm, let the words come, and let her phone do the listening. One recording captured Valerie, saying, "Honestly, your father and I are better off without all those reminders of his late wife. It's like the house was stuck in a museum. We needed to breathe again." Clara didn't flinch. She simply smiled, nodded, and kept the recording safe. Meanwhile, she discovered that her great-grandfather's rosary had surfaced in an online auction site that sold estate items. The listing matched exactly: wooden beads, slightly worn cross, and the initials MW carved faintly into the clasp. She messaged the seller, who confirmed they had bought the item in a bulk purchase from a private seller cleaning out attic boxes. Clara made the purchase, and after it arrived, she cried for the first time since the necklace. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming weight of recovery, of pulling pieces of her past back from the brink of oblivion. With every reclaimed heirloom, Clara felt something inside her rebuild. She was no longer just a daughter grieving a loss. She was a woman reclaiming a narrative that someone else had tried to delete. And then, she found the most unexpected lead. A volunteer from a local donation center emailed her to say they had received a music box matching Clara's description. Delicate ivory wood with floral inlays and a tiny swan painted inside the lid. It was still intact, still functional, and had been placed on a shelf for ornamental donation just 2 weeks ago. The center's intake records confirmed Valerie's name, listed on a donation form with the label Miscellaneous Sentimental Items. Clara picked up the next day and stood in the parking lot, turning the key until the familiar notes of Swan Lake played once more. The melody floated in the air like a whisper from her childhood, and that was when she knew she had enough. She wasn't after revenge in the petty sense. She didn't want to hurt Valerie. She wanted to hold her accountable. She wanted Valerie to understand that memory isn't disposable, that legacy isn't junk, that the woman who had built that house, who had raised Clara with love and strength, deserved better than a quiet erasure. Clara called Emily again. "I'm ready," she said. Let's draft the letter. The letter was printed on heavy white cardstock and sealed inside a plain envelope. No logo, no flourish. Just Clara's name and address in the top left corner and Valerie's in the center. Emily had written it with surgical precision, carefully measured and weighted with facts, not emotion. Clara had reviewed it line by line until she could recite it from memory. There was no aggression, no insult, only evidence, assertion, and consequence. This letter serves as a formal notification and demand for the acknowledgement of unauthorized disposal and sale of personal property belonging to Clara Whitmore, specifically items of significant sentimental and familial value, which were stored at the residence located at 413 Willowbend Drive. The aforementioned items include, but are not limited to, family heirlooms, handwritten journals, antique jewelry, religious artifacts, and embroidered household linens, all traceable to Clara's maternal lineage and legally considered her property under state inheritance and tenancy laws. The letter listed each recovered item and included appendices, photographs, receipts, timestamps, and even screenshots of the auction post. Attached was also a sworn affidavit from Clara outlining the events in full. At the end, the letter presented a demand, not for money, but for acknowledgement, restitution where possible, and a written apology. It also suggested that, should the matter be ignored, Clara reserved the right to file a civil claim for the unlawful disposal and personal damages resulting from emotional distress. Clara dropped the envelope into Valerie's mailbox herself. No drama, no confrontation. She simply walked to the front gate of her father's house one late Tuesday evening and slid it inside. Then she waited. 3 days passed without a word. On the 4th, Clara's father called. His voice was tense, edged with confusion. "I think we need to talk." She met him at a coffee shop midway between her apartment and Willowbend Drive. He arrived in his usual work shirt, sleeves rolled up, face flushed, not from anger, but from the discomfort of a man caught between two forces he didn't understand. "She's upset," he said after their drinks had arrived. "She says you're threatening her." "I'm not threatening her, Dad. I'm holding her accountable," Clara said calmly. "I didn't go to court. I didn't post anything online. I sent a private letter asking for acknowledgement and restitution for things she never had a right to touch." She said you're exaggerating, that you're overreacting. Clara reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. She slid it across the table without a word. Her father opened it and slowly flipped through the pages. The photographs of her mother's journal, the scanned receipt with Valerie's signature, the email from the auction seller, the itemized recovery log. By the time he reached the last page, he looked tired. "She didn't tell me. Not about any of this. I swear to you, Clara. I know. I believe you. But I need you to understand, this wasn't about clutter. This was about erasure." He nodded slowly. "What do you want from her?" "I want an apology. I want her to admit she made a decision that wasn't hers to make. And I want her to donate the money she made to the Silver Haven Women's Shelter. In Mom's name." His eyebrows lifted. "She sold memories, Dad. The least she can do is make sure something good comes out of it." He didn't argue. He just sighed and promised to speak to her. That evening, Clara received a brief, one-sentence email from Valerie. "You made your point." It was followed the next day by a formal envelope in the mail. Inside was a typed letter, stiffly worded but ultimately admitting responsibility. "While it was never my intention to cause harm, I recognize now that my actions resulted in emotional and personal distress to Clara Whitmore. I acknowledge that certain items disposed of were of irreplaceable sentimental value and regret the decision to discard or sell them without consulting the rightful owner. Enclosed is a copy of a donation made in honor of the late Sarah Whitmore, along with my sincere apology. Attached was a receipt showing a $1,200 donation made to the Silver Haven Women's Shelter under the name in memory of Sarah Whitmore. It wasn't everything, but it was enough. Clara sat with the letter for a long time. She didn't feel triumph. She didn't feel rage. Just a deep, aching relief. She folded the letter and filed it alongside her documentation. She hadn't screamed. She hadn't sought revenge in the explosive, public sense. But she had reclaimed her narrative. With calm words, persistence, and documentation, she had taken back what had been stolen. Not just the objects, but her mother's dignity. What she didn't expect, however, was what followed. 2 weeks after receiving the apology, Clara was approached by a woman named Janine, a board member at the shelter. Janine had seen the name Sarah Whitmore on the donation and, curious, reached out. She had been a childhood friend of Sarah's. They had lost contact after college. Seeing her name again, attached to a meaningful contribution, stirred something in Janine. She asked to meet Clara in person. They sat at a sunny cafe downtown. Janine brought old photos Clara had never seen, college memories, road trips, late-night study sessions. Sarah, in her youth, vibrant and full of mischief, with arms slung around friends and laughter on her face. Janine spoke of Sarah's strength, her kindness, and her dreams. It was as if a missing part of Clara's mother had returned to her. Your mother once said she wanted to open a center for women who had nowhere to go, Janine said. She never got the chance. But I think in some small way, this donation brought her back to that path. Clara walked home that evening feeling something she hadn't felt in months. Not revenge, not victory, but restoration. Her stepmother would never understand the depth of what she had tried to erase. But it didn't matter anymore. Sarah Whitmore's legacy had not only been recovered, it had expanded. Clara's quiet, methodical pursuit of justice had given her mother a new kind of life. Not one confined to a box in the attic, but one that now lived on in community, support, and story. And all of it, every reclaimed piece, every journal page, every string of recovered words, had built the foundation for something Valerie could never touch again. Clara had won. Elegantly. Clara stood before the mirror in her bedroom, fastening the clasp of the emerald necklace behind her neck. The metal was cool against her skin, but its weight felt reassuring now, grounding. It no longer symbolized just loss, it symbolized reclamation. Her reflection looked different these days. There was no dramatic transformation in her appearance, but something had shifted beneath the surface. She carried herself with a new certainty, an internal calm that came only after surviving the kind of quiet war most people never notice. She had recovered nearly everything that had been stolen or discarded. The music box, her mother's journals, the rosary, the embroidered table linens, and several handkerchiefs. A few items, like the silver mirror and brush set, remained untraceable. But Clara had stopped obsessing over them. Not because they didn't matter, but because she had realized something deeper. The objects were important, yes, but it was the memory and meaning she had fought for. And those had been fully restored. Word had quietly spread in the local community. The vintage shop owner who'd returned the necklace mentioned the situation in vague, respectful terms to others in her circle. Several local antique sellers began using Clara's story as an example of why documentation and seller identity mattered, especially when dealing with estate pieces. One small thrift store even posted a sign near their front counter that read, "Memory is not clutter. Please consider the story behind what you donate." Clara hadn't asked for that, but it moved her more than she could explain. A few weeks later, Janine from Silver Haven reached out again, this time with an invitation. "We're organizing our spring fundraiser," she said, "and we want you to speak." Me? Clara was stunned. I'm not a speaker." Janine laughed softly. "You're more than that. You're someone who turned personal grief into something meaningful. Your story has been making rounds here, staff, volunteers, even some of our residents. You've inspired more than one woman to retrieve something she thought she'd lost forever. You don't need to prepare anything fancy. Just speak from the heart." Clara didn't commit right away. She sat with the invitation for a week, unsure if she had the courage to stand on a stage and speak publicly about something that had once been so raw. But then she found herself holding her mother's journal one evening, flipping to a page she hadn't read before. "There will come a time when Clara won't need my voice to feel strong. She'll hear her own. And when she does, I hope she uses it." It was dated September 1997, 2 weeks before her mother was diagnosed. That settled it. On the day of the event, Clara wore a modest black dress, her hair pinned back the way her mother used to wear hers. The necklace shimmered beneath the lights of the community center auditorium. When her name was called, she stepped onto the stage and looked out at the sea of faces. Women of all ages, some seated with their children, others with their caregivers. Some were survivors of abuse, others rebuilding from addiction or homelessness. All of them were there because they believed, in some way, in starting over. Clara's voice was soft at first. I didn't plan to be here. Not at a fundraiser. Not on a stage. Not telling this story. It began with grief, the kind that sneaks up on you years after the funeral. The kind you pack into a trunk and store in an attic, thinking it will always be there, untouched, waiting for the right time. She paused. The room was silent. My stepmother threw away that trunk. Not because she's evil. Not because she wanted to hurt me. But because, to her, the past was disposable. She told me, your past is just getting in our way. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Clara took a breath and continued. She saw my mother's memory as clutter. But what she didn't understand is that those objects, the journals, the music box, the necklace, they were pieces of a map. A map that reminded me who I was and where I came from at a time when I felt like I was disappearing. She shared how she had tracked down the heirlooms, how she had approached it not with anger, but with determination. She spoke of the quiet power in documentation, in asking questions, in building a case not out of rage, but out of love. She told them about the donation made in her mother's name, and what it meant to see her mother's legacy, however unintentionally, woven into something that would help other women rebuild their lives. When she stepped off the stage, people stood. She didn't expect the applause. She didn't expect the tearful hugs, or the women who came up to her afterward holding their own heirlooms, asking for advice. One brought an old quilt, another, a faded letter. One woman simply held up a Polaroid and said, I thought this didn't matter anymore. But after hearing you, I think I'll frame it. That night, Clara walked home under a sky full of stars. There was a stillness to the air, the kind that comes only after closure. She wasn't the same person who had cried in her apartment weeks ago, clutching a photograph and wondering where to begin. She was someone who had walked the full circle of grief, confrontation, and recovery, and emerged intact. At her father's house, things changed too. He had quietly begun rearranging the photos on the hallway wall. Several had been taken down over the years after Valerie moved in, including the ones of Sarah and Clara from Clara's childhood. Slowly, quietly, her father began putting them back up. One Sunday, during a visit, Clara found a framed photograph on the living room mantel. Her mother holding baby Clara, smiling into the sunlight. Next to it was the recovered music box. Valerie never spoke of the letter again. She remained cordial, polite, but distant. She no longer commented on Clara's visits or offered unsolicited opinions about her sentimentality. The tension remained, but it was neutralized, diluted by accountability. Clara didn't need revenge anymore. She had created something better, a legacy. Years later, long after the dust of those events had settled, Clara would walk through her home, now filled with her own life and family, and pass by the restored heirlooms, the necklace in a shadow box, the journals on a shelf, the table runner used each Thanksgiving. Her children would ask, whose was this? And she would tell them stories, not just about Sarah, but about how memory can be lost and found, about how silence can speak louder than rage, about how dignity doesn't come from what you say in the heat of anger, but from what you do when no one else believes your pain matters. She would tell them, some people throw away the past because they don't understand it, but that doesn't mean you have to let it go with them. Her revenge hadn't come in the form of confrontation, public shame, or courtroom battles. It had come in quiet actions, emails, receipts, a velvet pouch, a journal entry. It had come in the slow, deliberate rebuilding of a legacy, one item at a time. Elegant, permanent, unforgettable. And in the end, Clara had proven, not just to Valerie, but to herself, that nothing truly meaningful can be erased if you're willing to fight for it. Not even a mother's memory.